You know, the issue of baptism and infant baptism in particular can be a tricky thing for conservative Bible-believing Baptists and Presbyterians to talk about for a whole variety of reasons. For one, for Baptists who believe that baptism means the baptism of a professing believer, there's not an acceptance that infant baptism that has been done by scores of Christians around the world and in over the course of history, that's not baptism. And consequently, when it comes time to join those churches, very often people that have been baptized as infants are required to be baptized as adult professing believers, and that can make Baptists look narrow on this issue, whereas those of us who are Paedo Baptists can look more accepting or broad. But I like to tell folks that are coming to First Pres in the Inquirers class process that I respect the principial position of Baptist churches on that point because they're wanting to be biblical in their view of baptism. They have an understanding of baptism that requires it to be for adult professing believers only, and they understand that to come to the Lord's table, you need to be baptized. So if you haven't received baptism, you shouldn't come to the Lord's table. You shouldn't be a part of the membership of the church. You want to explain for anybody out there who's listening to us, doesn't understand why Baptists think that, why infant baptism is unbiblical, you want to explain that to them?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the way you handle that in Inquirers class, because it is, as a pastor, I feel a sensitivity around that. We have many wonderful folks who are coming from Paedo Baptist backgrounds. They want to join the church. They love everything about the church. They love the people of the church. And then this becomes a hitch for them, a stumbling block. And you do get the sense that, people are looking at you like, you got all this water over here. You won't sprinkle a couple babies, And so, it's like, it's not about being stingy. We think this is a command of the Lord. But just from a Baptist perspective, broadly, we would see, I think, a kind of logical sequence of things. The preaching of the gospel, the working of God by His Spirit in preaching the gospel, in regeneration and conversion, and that reality being professed in baptism, which is sort of the doorway into the church and the privileges of the church, communion and so on. Which means then that we have this awkward kind of responsibility for trying to discern a credible profession of faith and sort of tacitly endorsing that profession in that entire process of baptizing someone, bringing them into membership, enjoying the Lord's table with them. We would see, and maybe you can help me think through this more, but where I think Presbyterians would see an analogy between circumcision in the Old Testament and baptism in the New, we would see discontinuities there. We would say one of the ways in which the New Covenant is different from the Old Covenant. It's not ethnic. It's it's the New Covenant. The circumcision of the heart, and so on and so forth. And so baptism properly belongs then to those who have had that experience of conversion.
And in short, a Presbyterian would argue for infant baptism by saying that in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, in the Abrahamic covenant and the New Covenant manifestation of God's covenant of grace, God has made promises to believers and their children. Genesis 17, the promises to you and your seed after you. Acts 2, the promises to you and to your children. And in both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, He's given specific signs of that promise that He's making. In the Old Covenant, circumcision, Genesis 17. In the New Covenant, baptism, Matthew 28 and Acts chapter 2. And that since God in both Old Covenant and New Covenant has made promises to believers and their children and has given signs of those promises, those signs should be applied to believers and their children. It's actually a pretty simple argument. I think sometimes, I was telling you before we started talking today that when I was growing up, I grew up in a county with 385 Baptist churches, Granville County, South Carolina, and there were like 14 Presbyterian churches. So all of my Baptist friends thought that the reason that Presbyterians baptized babies was either we hadn't thought about it, we were liberals, it was a hangover from Roman Catholicism, it was just a tradition thing. They had no idea that we actually had tried to think about this from a biblical standpoint. So I think on this issue, not unlike church government, Baptists and Presbyterians both believe that the Bible and the Bible alone should be our rule of faith and practice on how we practice here. We just come to different conclusions. And you're right to put your finger on continuity, discontinuity. I would quickly say Presbyterians believe there's discontinuity as well, even in the sacraments. On baptism and the Lord's Supper, there are significant discontinuities. Baptists view those discontinuities in a different way, but we do both agree on continuity, discontinuity.
I wonder if I can ask you a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Are there, and I appreciate that, you know, are there any difficulties created for Presbyterian when you sort of pastorally, practically, by infant baptism, by that practice? For does it raise any questions or pose any challenges about the nature of the church, the constitution of the church, and about things like shepherding, discipline, communion, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I would say yes. And here, let me laud the Baptist position for a second. One of the things that is beautiful about the Baptist position on baptism is that the church-world distinction is crystal clear in the church. The church is composed of professing, baptized believers. The world is outside of that. And that unites both at the place of profession of faith and at the administration of baptism. Whereas in Presbyterianism, that's separated by a degree of years. We believe in conversion just like Baptists do. We long for a public profession of faith, and we do not presume in the baptism of children that is going to happen. We don't presume that children are elect, but we long for that and pray for that. And so there isn't that clear line of demarcation as there is in the glories of Baptist ecclesiology at that point. And so I do think that means there are certain pastoral issues that we have to be particularly aware of.
It's excellent. And let's put a lance in any kind of Baptist pride about that, because as we see the age of baptism getting lower and lower and lower, we're becoming functional Presbyterians.
Mark, our friend Mark never talks about that all the time. You know, the dangers of infant dedication, the slippery slope to infant baptism. Well, we won't solve this today, but maybe people will understand more what Baptists and Presbyterians think about infant baptism.
Love you, brother.
Yeah, you too.